So if you do have a situation where this is out of flat and there's quite a bit of a gap over here, the crown is happening this way. So two things to resolve that issue would be, one, to recenter this screw into the thickness of this board. The other thing we can do, actually I want to move this one too before. Alright, so we've got those two better centered. The thing I recommend with every glue up is alternating. So we have clamps on both faces, and this helps to balance off or balance out this imbalance situation about where it is we need to be. You're still, no, you're good, you're good. So that's how this thing is going to go. You'll notice the marks here on the end grain as far as direction of the board. If you remember talking about wood flattening over time, if I alternate, so I have smiley faces here, frowns over here, as this one starts to flatten out by creating more of a frown, this one's going to create more of a smile. It'll offset a little bit of that movement. If I were to flip this board around, we have a smiley board, then that will be more pronounced, and you're kind of fighting, or you'll have to design around that movement with whatever your design is going to be. So just keeping that in mind, the overall aesthetic of how these go together should always be considered, but we can't discount the physics and the movement of this material. Okay, so in preparation of doing an actual glue up, I'm going to pull in these things. These are referred to as cauls, C-A-U-L-S, cauls. And the cauls are pretty great in helping to elevate this material, and I can easily get cracks underneath here and where I need. It's a little bit tight as far as my workspace now, but I'm going to work around it. So I've got clamps that I need. Two clamps, yes, good. The number of clamps is always in question, and there's something that happens with clamping this material together where we have to think about where or how this force is going to be broadcast. So we know that between these 2 points there's pressure, but what we don't think about is that pressure is broadcast, and it's almost exactly a 45-degree angle from here to here. So for this clamp, I should be able to take care of most of this half of the board. With the second clamp, I'll have a little bit of overlap in the center, and I'm totally fine. The only reason I need a third clamp in this environment is just, again, to balance out so this board doesn't start being clamped in a shape that is less than flat. I will use my F-clamps when I'm getting into clamping this thing, but we'll talk about application of adhesive first. Alright, so as we discussed, just a regular PVA glue here. This is Titebond 1. Totally fine for indoor applications and for non-exotic woods, wood-to-wood contact. This is a great option. If we had something where we were adhering dissimilar materials, like wood to plastic or metal to wood or whatever, then we start getting into a broader conversation. But wood to wood, this is totally fine. You'll see that I put down a bead of adhesive and then just agitating this back and forth. What I'm looking for is that I have nice consistent adhesive everywhere. And some of the squeeze out I'll pull back into this. But I want to start to activate this glue as much as I can. And if this is clamped together so it'll hold like so, that gives me enough holding power to work with. The open time on adhesive or water-based adhesives like this is kind of the trickiest part of these things. We have about 30 minutes of what they call open time. The open time is the amount of time that we have before this really starts to set in and be a permanent bond. But that's different from our working time. Working time is much, much, much less. The working time on this is closer to 5 to 10 minutes, depending on the temperature and a couple of variables. But the warmer it is, the faster this is going to start to kick. So disc glue up is ready. I'm in good shape. I got lucky with the alignment here and here. If I were having any problems with the alignment, the F clamps are custom made for doing something like this, where if these are the same thickness boards, I can clamp right across the glue line, and then these will start to align or pull themselves into shape. If they need a little bit of convincing, I could use this long handle as leverage. And I can do this on both ends, and then I can get my alignment dialed in. You'll notice when I did clamp, I started from one side and then I started working my way down. That allows me to start shifting up and down these two boards, get the alignment. What I don't want to do is, after the alignment has been set and I've got good pressure on these clamps, the last thing I want to check is flatness. Flatness looks pretty great. The last thing I want to do is remove these clamps. These clamps are made out of steel, and the steel reacts with the water in the glue and the tannins in the wood, and it's going to leave you a really nasty blue or black stain where those things have engaged. So I want to get rid of these things as fast as I possibly can, because that goes fairly deep in the pores of the wood and it's so difficult to remove. So, all right, last stage of gluing up. And this is somewhat debatable or controversial, is what do we do with this glue here that's left? I am of the opinion that I want to get rid of this stuff as soon as I possibly can so that it doesn't dry in place. If it dries in place, not the end of the world. You'd have to scrape it out. You'd have to do some level of manually removing it. But it's just so much easier to deal with it when it's at this point. Oops. And I'll do it on both faces. A lot of people talk about this being the worst thing you could possibly do because it starts to dilute that adhesive and pack it into the fibers of the board. And I certainly understand that argument. I've just never had an issue with it. As long as I'm going to be either sanding, scraping, planing, or running through the planer, any of this adhesive that might be left behind is not ever going to interfere with finish application or even adhering something onto this surface. So I just want to get rid of all of it. It just seems like it is the time to do it is now, and it's so easy. If you did want to leave this in a place and then deal with it without using water, there's kind of a timing play on that one, in that you've got about 15 minutes to let this stuff start to set and get tacky or gummy before you start coming in and pulling it off. If it's fully hardened, again, you can scrape it out, but it's just a disaster. So I would do it this way: get rid of all the glue. The alignment here is good, and then a little bit of light sanding, and then you can go about getting to your next pieces. The one thing I want to point out here with this style of clamps, I didn't really mention this as I was putting this together because time was a factor. This pipe is not making contact with that glue for the same reason we were talking about with the F clamps. If this were to be a little bit lower, that glue and the steel in this clamp would start to interact, and you get a nasty blue stain in there. And so by elevating these things up, getting the screw in proper alignment, it creates this gap on all of these clamps, the one that you can't see as well. And so I won't have any problem with staining the board here from the clamp. So I do this. I let this sit for this type of adhesive. It only needs to sit for 30 minutes. Room temperature stuff, all that. If you're a cooler in your shop, then you have to let it sit longer, but 30 minutes is it. and then it's ready to go. Be careful about milling operations. If you wanted to wait 30 minutes and jump back into doing something, you could, I suppose. But be careful about our saw stops, because if there is any moisture between these two, then the saw stop will read that moisture and will trip their brake, and that gets to be really unfortunate. So I would just let this sit, and then 30 minutes later, take this one out, put another one together to glue up, and then you can start milling them all at the same time, usually overnight. All right, that's cool enough.